Joining us now from Oakland University is Assistant Professor of Management, Dr. Michael Greiner, who is with the university's School of Business Administration. Michael, thank you as always for joining us.
It's great to be here. Happy Friday.
Yeah, happy Friday to you as well. As we continue to look at the state of our economy, a lot of this circles back to the job market. And here in Michigan, it's an interesting scenario in comparison to many of the other 50 states, in the 49 other states in the union. So in terms of the jobs outlook, where does Michigan stand in comparison to many of these other states? We know that in some cases, Michigan's in a better position, but it's not necessarily the best place in the union for jobs.
Yeah, it's kind of interesting. We actually just this morning got some new jobs data for March, and it appears that still the jobs market is very strong, although it's slowed slightly. The good news is some people seem to be coming off the sidelines. I've seen some articles recently in, for example, Bridge, Michigan, actually, where they were talking about the fact that many retirees are starting to come back to work because they're being drawn to it by increasing wages. Well, interestingly enough, in Michigan in particular, our jobs market relative to the rest of the country is not all that strong, actually. In fact, out of 56 major metropolitan areas, we're ranked 51st. So that's not so great. Interestingly enough, just above New York City, which was kind of a surprise to me. But of course, New York City's been dealing with all kinds of issues with finance slowing down and with, of course, people not moving back into the city and not wanting to come back into the office buildings that they vacated as a result of COVID. So that being said, our unemployment rate is probably higher than it is in certain other parts of the country. We've also got less labor force participation than in certain parts of the country. And, it makes some sense, actually. We just saw that GM announced that they have asked for certain voluntary personnel reductions. They said that they wanted to forcibly, essentially, lay off about 500 white-collar workers. Well, now it turns out that they went to their white-collar workforce and asked for volunteers, essentially, offering them a buyout to get them to voluntarily leave the workforce. As it turns out, actually, my son's father-in-law is one of those white-collar workers who decided to accept a buyout. We just heard the other day. And as a result, GM actually just announced that they're not going to need to engage in involuntary layoffs because of the fact that so many people have taken the buyout package. So that's good news there. But it shows that there's been kind of this slowdown in the workforce here in Michigan that you haven't seen in some other parts of the country. We saw a few months ago that Ford, for example, laid off as many as 3,000 people. And there's been talk about the fact that they might lay off some more. And it has to do with a couple of factors. I mean, number one, we had this weird situation where there was high demand for vehicles, and then suddenly we had COVID come. Suddenly people weren't buying vehicles, and suddenly they were buying them again. And at the same time, they were having trouble getting semiconductors. So they had this real challenge of kind of trying to balance supply with demand. And actually, one of the things that initially kicked off the whole spate of inflation that we're dealing with right now had a lot to do with the fact that people were paying a lot of money for used cars because they couldn't get new cars because they weren't available. Well, now it appears that the automakers have pretty much been able to rebuild their inventory. And at the same time, though, they're also moving over toward more electric vehicles. As it turns out, electric vehicles have fewer moving parts than internal combustion engines. And as a result of that, there's an expectation that there will be fewer employees needed by the automakers as they move into this electric vehicle era. We're seeing some competition among states to try to attract the employees that there will be. In fact, I saw that Ohio in particular is being very aggressive about it. And you can bet that Michigan's really trying to hold on to those jobs as well. But one thing that is clear is it seems like the overall workforce of the auto industry is shrinking a little bit. And Michigan, of course, as you know, we rely on that auto industry. So I think it's not all that surprising that the overall job growth here hasn't been as great as you've seen in some other parts of the country. The other thing, too, is that one of the big industries that has seen a lot of job growth is tourism. Because of the fact, again, so many people weren't traveling during COVID, and then it came roaring back after as things started to open up. And as a result of that, that's been one of the big areas of growth. Well, I mean, Michigan isn't exactly, a tourist mecca, although we have some great tourist destinations, don't get me wrong. I don't think anybody would mistake us for Florida. So that being said, the areas where you're seeing the stronger job growth isn't really one of our great strengths of our economy, and some of the areas seeing weaker job growth is actually where our economy is based. So you're seeing slower job growth here. One thing that is encouraging, though, is that with wage growth, interestingly enough, Michigan is relatively strong. We're about in the middle of the pack. And I think, again, that has to do with the fact that Michigan, relative to some other parts of the country, we have relatively strong unions. They've been able to push the employers to increase wages and keep the pace of the wage increases up as much as can be with the pace of inflation, which has been a real positive for the people who are working. But one thing's for sure is we don't have the kind of active job force here in Michigan that I think you can see in some other parts of the country.
And we've talked about that before. The metrics we have on job numbers may not be entirely accurate because there's been so much time between when many of these people had left the workforce versus now. And the unemployment metrics in particular, they only go off of people that have been out of work for a certain period of time. But you also mentioned people are starting to come off of the sidelines and get back into the labor force. So in Michigan, how is that affecting our numbers too? Are we seeing more people come off the sidelines and seek work? And perhaps is that also impacting our unemployment numbers?
Yeah, we definitely are. And that's kind of one of the ironies here, which you point out exactly right, which is that we have kind of these weird ways of calculating unemployed. You'd think that unemployed simply means people not working. Well, in fact, it actually means percentage of people who are not working who are part of the overall workforce. So, in other words, who are either looking for work or who are working. So you have this large group of people who may simply not be part of the workforce for various reasons. Now, some of them could be voluntary, things like, say, they are retired or they are stay-at-home parents, that type of thing. The other issue, though, is that you'll get what are called discouraged workers, where they say, hey, I've been looking for work and I've been unable to find work, so I've kind of given up. And that certainly is a factor of that number. And I think what we're starting to see, though, is that because of the fact that wages are going up, you're seeing, especially here in Michigan, you're seeing more and more of these retired workers in particular who'd said, hey, I'm kind of tired of working. I've enjoyed this time off with COVID. I don't necessarily want to go back to work. And so they've been staying on the sidelines, and that's actually been lowering our unemployment rate. Well, as they've come back to the workforce, ironically, our unemployment rate actually goes up, even though we're actually increasing the number of people working, simply because you've got more people coming off the sidelines than you've got increases in jobs. So it's kind of one of those weird dynamics. But certainly, we've seen that there's been an increase of people moving from the status of being retired back into the workforce, and that's certainly something that means that we have. Fewer jobs that are available at this point, and that's certainly reflected in the unemployment figures that we're seeing relative to other parts of the country.
Michael Greiner is an assistant professor of management at Oakland University's School of Business Administration, joining us as he does every week for our weekly markets and economy segment here on the Megacast. You can always find us on demand on civiccentertv.com/Megacast to keep up to date on the latest information affecting you here in Michigan and, of course, around the world and the U.S., which also affects us right here in the Great Lakes state. Michael, you mentioned earlier on that despite the current job numbers, wage numbers in Michigan are looking pretty positive. That wouldn't be what would be said by those working in graduate positions at our universities, particularly at the University of Michigan. But we also know there have been protests beginning among graduate workers at Grand Valley State as well and other universities across the union. So what is going on in terms of that in higher education, particularly those graduate workers?
Yeah, well, it's a tough situation. As a former graduate worker myself, I can tell you that they are not paid particularly well and never have been. But that being said, they're kind of getting squeezed from a couple of factors. Of course, everyone's dealing with inflation, and that's always a factor. But we're also dealing with the fact that many of these workers are unionized, and as a result of that, they're covered by long-term union contracts. So these long-term union contracts don't necessarily take into consideration the fact that, we've been having this high rate of inflation lately. And so as a result, I actually saw recently a study that showed that among educators, generally speaking, and certainly among grad assistants in particular, that they've actually, on a real basis, been losing ground with their wages. So, unlike in certain other professions where you see a lot more, I guess, vitality in the wage market, where there's competition among wages to bring people on, you don't see that so much in the education arena, and that's made especially worse given the fact that we're dealing with a bit of a demographic crisis nationally right now. You see, what happened is after the baby boomers had kind of finished their process of education and kind of came off the sidelines, there was an expectation that there'd be less need for higher education, that fewer people would be graduating from high school and therefore going on to higher education. Well, that was kind of delayed because of the fact that suddenly it became clear that the new economy that we were having required much higher education, and that the value of a college education is really something that really can't be equaled virtually in any other way throughout the workforce. So as a result of that, you saw this increase in the percentage of people who were graduating from high school going on to college. And that's been kind of a wave then that has sustained higher education for the past couple decades. Well, now that appears to be kind of coming to an end, where the declining size of the young people in America is starting to hit education, where there are fewer and fewer people graduating from high school, and that's certainly true in Michigan. And as a result of that, fewer and fewer people potentially going on to college. Well, that doesn't, ironically, impact universities like, say, the University of Michigan or Michigan State that recruit nationally. It's also had a relatively small impact, for example, on some commuter schools, more commuter schools, schools like, say, Oakland University, which of course I'm grateful for, but certainly interestingly, U of M Flint, which actually among the schools other than U of M and Michigan State in particular is one of the better schools in terms of retaining the number of students that it's got. The biggest schools that have been impacted, frankly, are kind of the mid-tier schools that tend to be schools that people go away to. As I understand it, for example, Central Michigan University had to close an entire dorm just because they don't have the numbers going to the school that they did in the past. So we're seeing this across the board in the education process. So there's kind of this squeeze going on, and at the same time, we're also seeing new competitors coming to the table, where at one point you had higher education was frankly kind of a monopoly. Let's face it, where you had the universities who were in a position that they could kind of state the price and people were willing to pay for it. Well, now you're seeing more private universities coming to the table, more alternative universities. People have access to other universities online, for example, where it used to be that you'd have to go to a university that was located near you. So as a result of that, there's this downward pressure then on the costs that the universities are able to charge. So you see this tension then where universities are now dealing with some difficult finances. And that has certainly impacted the wages then that they're paying all of the instructors and certainly the graduate students in particular. And large part of it has to do, frankly, with the fact that graduate instructors have relatively little power in the workforce. Let's face it, they are students. They are basically there to learn. And as a result of that, they're not viewed as being as critical to the workforce as, say, the college professors themselves. Well, as it turns out, though, over the past, say, 30 years or so, there's been this move in the universities more and more to rely on part-time instructors and graduate assistants to teach more and more classes. So as a result of that, when you see this strike happening, it actually has had a huge impact on U of M, and it's shut down a lot of the classes that they've had ongoing, to the point where U of M actually had to go to court, and they asked the court to put a stop to the strike. And that effort actually was unsuccessful in court. So it'll be interesting to see what happens there.
Yeah, it's a lot of information on that. We have a couple articles that are linked to, I believe, one from MLive and one from another publication locally on our local news page on civiccentertv.com. If you scroll to about the lower third of the page, you'll get a couple of those articles from the beginning of the week as it was reaching that 1 week point in the protests and in the strike. by graduate students at Michigan, at the University of Michigan, and then even after the ruling by the courts to ultimately not put in that preliminary injunction on the strike, with the University of Michigan claiming that it was an illegal strike per their deal with that particular union. Plenty of more to develop on that story, so stick to our local news page for all of that. Michael Greiner joins us for our weekly market and economy segment here on the Megacast. He's with Oakland University, where he serves as an assistant professor of management in their School of Business Administration. Also making a big impact across our state and really across the U.S. is the sunset of many of these COVID-19 provisions that were helping both on the healthcare side and on the economic side. For people here in Michigan, we're starting to see an impact of the end of some of those pandemic protections and expenses that were going toward these families to help them pay for food and other items that are necessities in their homes because of lost wages due to the COVID-19 pandemic. Now that those benefits are going away, we're seeing that already begin to have a major impact on these families, particularly those that were receiving SNAP benefits here in Michigan. Just how big of an impact is this having?
Yeah, it's a huge impact. And this is something that I think we in Michigan really need to be concerned about because basically what you saw happen is as a result of COVID, there were these emergency measures that were put into effect. One of them was to dramatically increase the amount of food assistance that people got. That's known as SNAP. It stands for Supplemental Nutrition Assistance Program. It's what people used to refer to as food stamps. And what you've seen is a decline from people getting as much as a couple $100s a month in food assistance down to as little as $24 a month. So it's been a huge impact on the amount of money that people are receiving. At the same time, another pandemic program that's expiring has to do with Medicaid. And what that is that during COVID, there was this rule put in place that states couldn't kick people off of Medicaid. So you have to remember the way Medicaid works is it's largely funded by the federal government, but it's actually administered by each individual state, who then pays a certain percentage of how it operates. And so in each state, what they do is that they will determine, who's eligible and who's not eligible. And then they'll go through different administrative processes to enforce that. Well, what the federal government said is because of this COVID crisis, you can't engage in these administrative processes and you can't kick anybody off of Medicaid. Well, that might sound like a good thing because, people who don't deserve it shouldn't be getting the assistance. But the fact is that so much of this bureaucracy ends up being this burden that a lot of people have trouble maintaining. Let me give you an example. Say somebody who is unemployed has to move. They don't update their address regularly with Medicaid. Medicaid might send them certain letters saying, "Hey, you need to update your income information with us." If they don't get that letter because of the fact that they're moving, because they're dealing with this dislocation with their job situation, then they might be kicked off Medicaid, even though they're still eligible for it. And in fact, there's an estimate that as many as 400,000 Michiganders might lose their Medicaid coverage as a result of this change, and that as much as half of them might be eligible for Medicaid, but yet lose it anyway. So if there's any guidance I think that we should be giving to everybody who is involved in Medicaid is make sure your address is up to date and and you stay in touch with the Medicaid offices and respond to any letters that are out there. I think that's a critical message we need to get out to everybody. From a public policy standpoint, there's talk about potentially making it where you don't just kick someone off Medicaid, but you shift them into one of the Obamacare plans that are out there, and give them a kind of a couple of months to transition. That's an approach that's being taken in Rhode Island and California, and it's been proposed here in Michigan. It hasn't been resolved yet, but the goal is to try to soften this a little bit because you could imagine the difficulty that many of these people have if they're out of work. They've been covered by Medicaid. They suddenly find themselves sick and surprise, surprise, all of a sudden you find you're not covered with your health insurance anymore. That could be a real crisis. So I think that we're going to see some real dislocation among people between this reduction in SNAP benefits at the same time as we're dealing with inflation, and then people getting kicked off Medicaid, many of whom should be on it anyway. And again, this all comes down to the fact that these emergency measures that were put in place as a result of COVID are coming to an end.
And lastly, Michael, just to go off of that, for more information, there was a really good article in MLive recently about some of these benefits going away, where people were receiving, because of these benefits during the pandemic, several $100s a month for food to support themselves and their families, and now could be cut down in one case as low as $23 for an entire month. And just think about it in the context of our current times and your most recent trip to the grocery store. $23 isn't going to cut it for a full month. So this is a really important story, and glad that we discussed it today. Lastly, partly what's affecting some of the prices of goods going up and down all over the place is the price of gasoline, and really connected to that is the price of oil. We've seen some up and downs recently, but mostly ups of late. What is causing that, Michael? It can't just be some random trash fire in an office in Henderson, Nevada.
I know you got that right. It is. Unfortunately, we're talking about OPEC again. And many of us who were around back in the early 70s remember the crisis that OPEC caused back then, and how they've been kind of manipulating oil prices across the world. Well, they're back. And in this time, it's not just OPEC being kind of the Middle Eastern countries that people are thinking about, but they call it OPEC Plus, which includes such countries as Nigeria and, yes, Russia, that we've heard so much about with their invasion in Ukraine. Well, ironically, Russia has been very frustrated by the fact that they haven't been earning the kind of money that they've wanted to from their oil exports to help finance their war in Ukraine. And as a result of that, they've been reducing their production for a number of months now, with the aim of increasing prices so they're able to generate more revenues. Well, that has not been particularly successful. So now the concern is that it appears that Saudi Arabia and some of the other allies who are in OPEC have stepped up to the table to help Russia in that regard and to drive oil prices a little bit up more. It appears that the goal that they want to achieve is to get oil prices up above $80 a barrel. Which is, lately it's been in the low 70s dollar per barrel area. So you can imagine that's going to have an impact on the pump. It could push gas prices up to, close to $4 a gallon if we're not careful. So the challenge right now is going to be that OPEC, they basically want to reduce production, and thereby, kind of that old supply demand curve we're always talking about. You have less supply that's going to drive up prices, and that's exactly what they're trying to accomplish here. I can tell you, though, that this whole situation sticks a little bit in the craw of many of us, myself included, when you think some of the countries that are involved in this. I mean, of course, you're talking about Saudi Arabia, you're talking about Kuwait, and you're talking about Iraq, all countries that the United States made huge investments in to protect over the past couple decades. And yet here they are raising oil prices on us again. So that is, I must say, kind of annoying. But unfortunately, it's the way things go. And until the United States is really able to reduce our dependency on foreign oil, which we have done a great job on, but still, it's what drives the market out there. Then until that happens, then we're going to continue to see OPEC continuing to have this control over our own destiny.
Well, Michael, we appreciate you joining us as always to talk about these stories that are affecting us directly here in Michigan and indirectly also affecting us here in Michigan from a few other steps, including the current crisis with what's going on in terms of oil prices jumping all over the place through OPEC and OPEC Plus as well. Thank you so much for being with us.
Great to be here. Have a great weekend.